It's just about to come into view. There it is, one of the last readouts of the mainland moose in Atlantic Canada. But as you can see in this aerial video, the land is profoundly damaged. It is an unhealthy environment. How did it get this way, you might ask? Well, my friend, that is a long and sordid tale, but I think the time has come to bring it to light. The clouds conceal the broken land, just as the Nova Scotia provincial government, in conjunction with the forestry cartel, has sought to conceal a long and sordid history of environmental abuse and racism. But the people of Atlantic Canada are beginning to wake up. They've had enough, and they're saying so. And whether of First Nations descent, Scots, or from any of the other numerous peoples that have come to settle this land over the millennia, they are coming together to make their voices heard. Do you hear them? They're there, just down there, below the cloud cover, in protest of the mismanagement and corruption rife within the Department of Lands Forestry, in defiance of the avarice and disregard that drives the misdeeds and disinformation of the forestry cartel. They are right down there, in the shadow of broken woods, beneath the gray of this cumulus cloud. They have come together to make their voices heard, and they will not be ignored. They have gathered from the forest to the halls of government and willingly turned themselves over to abuse and arrest, and all for the simple, honest purpose of standing for the right thing. But how did it come to be that so many folk had to come together to fight their own government, to compel it to simply follow its own environmental laws and principles? If we were to try to trace this to the beginning, I would have to transform this video into a series that would take many years to complete. But at its heart, I believe that this predicament arose due to two factors. One was environmental racism. Nova Scotia's history is riddled with environmental racism, and one of the more notorious examples is how Nova Scotia has treated its own First Nations folk. The voices of the Mi'kmaq people, who lived in balance with these Dawn lands for millennia, were ignored and stifled, not just in the brutality of the colonial past, but right up into recent history. One of the most recent and egregious examples to come to light happened only a few years ago, when Stephen McNeil, a former appliance repairman who somehow clawed his way to the top of the provincial government and head of the provincial Liberal Party, exemplifying the reality that politics is a world where qualifications don't matter, was implicated in an effort to subvert First Nations water protectors. They were fighting to prevent Alton Gas from building vast salt caverns beside the ecologically sensitive Shubenacadie River. The construction of these caverns would have released thousands of tons of salt into the river and run a risk of fuel leakage. Then Premier Stephen McNeil was implicated in a plan to stop the First Nations protests by proposing that the First Nations folk did not need to be consulted because they were, and I quote, a conquered people, effectively dismissing them on the basis of race and history. This willingness to dismiss persons and entities as unimportant exemplifies the very essence of environmental racism, and is, without doubt, foundational to the belief that some life is unimportant. The other force that I believe is at the heart of this ongoing destruction of crucial environment is the very real fact of corporate capture of key government agencies responsible for environmental care and conservation. By definition, corporate capture is a phenomenon where private industry uses its political influence to take control of the decision-making apparatus of the state, such as regulatory agencies, law enforcement entities, and legislatures, according to the Center for Constitutional Rights. Corporate capture takes place in many forms. Some of the most obvious and marginally legal is the giving of gifts and donations to politicians' campaigns. And there is the illegal but certainly occurring practice of bribery. But in Nova Scotia, we often see corporate capture occurring when former government officials take positions with big industries for whom they had pushed, when they were in office, favorable regulation. And while many political ethicists propose that it should be forbidden for politicians to take positions following office with corporations for whom they pushed favorable regulation, Nova Scotia possesses some striking examples of just that. One of the most glaring is that of former Premier John Ham, who was in public office as Premier from 1999 to 2006, and following the end of his political career, later became a board member of the controversial Northern Pulp, infamous in Nova Scotia, particularly Pictou County, for its massive deforestation programs, intended to produce conifer pulp despite any expense to the environment, as well as the enormous amount of air and water pollution that were produced by its plant, which operated just outside the village of Pictou. In fact, the giving of lucrative positions to politicians and public officials upon leaving office could almost said to be standard operating procedure within these Atlantic provinces. Though, another all too common form of corporate capture occurs when a person who works for one of these corporations manages to secure a job in office or as part of some regulating body. And as if Nova Scotia is desperate to prove that it simply cannot offer enough examples of corporate capture, if we do just a little bit of digging, we discover that John Porter, former woodlands manager at Bowater, a now defunct forestry company, is now the executive director for renewable resources with Lands and Forestry. And it is this particularly toxic combination of environmental racism and virtually unchecked corporate capture that leads to a process of toxic policy making based on bias, bigotry, disregard of science, and lastly, pure and simple greed, that has led to a situation tantamount to environmental holocaust here in the Atlantic provinces, presently under a deluge of assaults from gold mining interests, oil and gas companies, and chemical companies looking to use the provinces to store their products and their waste, the coastal areas under the poisonous assaults of fish farms, and the last of the almost exterminated ecosystem of the Acadian forests being felled to feed the endless hunger of the pulp cartel for wood chips and so-called biofuel to feed the furnaces of European and Canadian power plants. So, between a premier who has declared the opinions of Aboriginal peoples who are now water and land protectors to be irrelevant, another former premier who jumped ship from politics to become a chair of a pulp cartel board, and a jefe of a major forestry company who is now in a decision-making role in the Department of Lands and Forestry. Well, with a toxic history like that, it is no wonder the province's Department of Lands and Forestry was recently brought to task in court by groups representing the interests of ecology, environment, and conservation to do its job and protect the endangered wildlife within this province, a court battle which the Department of Lands and Forestry lost conclusively. But losing the court battle was not enough. The autocratic government of Nova Scotia has decided, regardless of whatever the courts have ruled, that it will not do its job. Instead, it will allow another forestry company, Westfor, to continue cutting operations in woodlands that are among the very last holdout of the desperately endangered Nova Scotia Mainland moose. And regardless of any and all concerns expressed by scientists, naturalists, and allied conservationists, and the general public, the government and the Department of Lands and Forestry have turned a resolute deaf ear against the outcry of the public. And so it is that a situation was precipitated where grandmothers and grandfathers, parents and children, conservationists, naturalists, scientists, teachers, and others, from towns and villages in the Atlantic Coast cities and the First Nations communities, found that they must come together to express their outrage, gathering protests in the towns, and creating camps deep in the forest to protect the mainland moose territory from the deaf hunger of Westfor's loggers, and the frankly, we don't give a damn attitude of a Nova Scotia government and regulating bodies, which have demonstrated through their deeds conclusively that their only interest is their personal career advancement and the goals of their corporate overlords. Before the coming of European settlers, the Nova Scotia mainland moose, Alces americana, was widespread throughout the province, though at times its population fluctuated. But, as has been the circumstance in so many places around the world, when people showed up, pressure was applied, and the European settlers in particular began to apply tremendous pressure on the Nova Scotia mainland moose. Today, that pressure derives from poachers, a disease called P. tenuis caused by a brainworm for which white-tailed deer are carriers, which is fatal to moose. And some pressure derives to a very small degree from black bears. But by far, the greatest source of pressure on the Nova Scotia mainland moose, as well as upon many other endangered creatures which dwell in Nova Scotia, is loss of habitat. And in the heavily forested Atlantic provinces, the greatest threat to habitat is deforestation. In particular, industrial-scale deforestation caused by consortiums or cartels such as Westfor, a conglomerate of pulp mills and allied forestry industries. And the effects of forestry on the mainland moose's habitat is indisputable. Less than 1% of Nova Scotia's native woodlands survive unblemished and undamaged. Much of Nova Scotia's forests have been converted into pulp spruce plantations, which are essentially barrens, little able to support biodiversity. because they are vast monocrops that offer little in the way of food. And throughout the entire province of Nova Scotia, only a few small readouts of woodlands and wild country substantial enough to support the mainland moose remain. These are found in and around the interior of the eastern shore from Tangier Grand through Guysborough, in the Cobequid Mountains, around the Chiboucto Peninsula, in and about the Pictou Antigonish Highlands, and, perhaps especially due to its size and wildness, around the Tobeatic region. And it is here, on the frontier of the Tobeatic, that the protesters have made their stand. Once again, we turn to the miracle of modern aviation simulation technology to reveal the land for which they are concerned. The software that I am using is the 2020 version of the Microsoft Flight Simulator, which pilots have used for decades to get their simulator time. The 2020 version of the Microsoft Flight Simulator is the most advanced and the most interesting because it very accurately presents the entire world by using satellite imagery to relate the landscape. Through applying a technology called photogrammetry, the landscape is rendered into a 3D version of itself that is true to the satellite imagery and thus accurately relates what would be seen were you yourself to travel through the area. Here, I am using a well-simulated version of the Extra 330 LT, a light, nimble, propeller-driven aircraft, to get an aerial view of the landscape between the two protester camps. And while the satellite image I had previously shown related the land from a perspective of 25 kilometers up, the flight simulator shows us the same landscape from a height of 650 meters give or take, or roughly 2,200 feet. This is the land that concerns the protesters. This is the crown land that the forestry cartel claims to manage well. Pale green patches represent clear cuts. Pale green patches with dark green rows in them represent clear cuts that have been replanted to become spruce plantations, barely fit for wildlife, useful only to the pulp cartel. Brown patches and pale green patches devoid of any trees are new clear cuts. And as you can see, in every direction that you look, the land has been substantially damaged. It is either in a state of currently being clear cut or has been clear cut sometime within the last couple decades. And all about in every direction, the land is riddled with logging roads and forestry access roads. These roads indicate that that forest land around them is either being surveyed to be cut or is being converted from true biodiverse forest into something which will benefit only the forestry cartels. And to make matters worse, those ubiquitous forestry access roads often come to serve as poacher access roads. And poaching, right along with unchecked rampant forestry, is one of the main causes of the decline of the Nova Scotia Mainland moose. This landscape, which the Nova Scotia Forestry Cartel, in particular West 4, claims to manage well, is simply a patchwork of clear cuts and land in transition to clear cuts, and a little healthy forest, inevitably to become more pulp plantation. The evidence is right there below you, written in the land, revealed through the indifferent eye of satellites which have captured and documented it all. Everywhere you go, everywhere you turn, even from thousands of feet in the air, there is very little to be seen in the way of healthy habitat for large animals such as the mainland moose and the many smaller endangered plants and animals which still survive in the Nova Scotia woods here and there, despite the indifference of the Department of Lands Forestry, which has done the equivalent of nothing to fulfill its duty and protect them. Turning back to the satellite imagery, we see that the land north, south, and west of one of the protest camps is a mess of old and new clear cuts. This land, which gets ever closer to the Tobeatic wilderness, is or was a buffer area protecting the mainland moose. To survive, these large animals require a variety of habitats. They require open meadows as well as parklands for nutritional variety. They require wetlands for heavy feeding. And they require heavy forests for shelter, especially during the winters when the heavy snow comes. And they require someplace safe from poachers. But the unchecked forestry operations conducted in this region and others have left the mainland moose virtually no place at all. From the southeast to the northwest of the province, this is the fate of the Acadian forest. Trees, old and young, hardwoods and softwoods, some like these, over 100 years old with trunks more than 20 inches in diameter, hacked away to feed the maws of pulp mills and the hungry flames of biofuel plants. And bit by bit, the old forest, so crucial to the survival of so many of Nova Scotia's endangered species, including the Nova Scotia Mainland moose, are reduced to rutted wastelands of stumps, mature forests converted into barren ruts, prone to erosion, a landscape open to the deep snows and biting winds of winter, where an ancient ecosystem has been cast away and discarded like so much detritus. Where this Wild West unchecked style of forestry was heading has been known for some time, and a little digging pulled up this article, a recovery plan for moose Alsace americana in mainland Nova Scotia, created in March 2007. It was actually published by the Nova Scotia government at the website shown above. Having read over the plan, my personal conclusion is that it's very good, and cites, both fairly and squarely, the problems that have led to the mainland moose's endangerment. In particular, in section 2.4.2, Narrative to Support Recovery Planning Table, it is noted that the development activities that affect long-term loss of habitat and local-scale activities that change the configuration and types of habitats, e.g. forestry, over shorter time periods need to be discerned at ecosystem scales. Fundamentally, what it is saying is that our style of forestry, primarily clear-cutting, impacts the ecosystem on a cumulative level, more and more over time. And this impact is making it increasingly difficult for the mainland moose to survive at all. As the report discusses the steps that will be necessary to save the mainland moose, it carefully notes that the factors affecting the moose's status are poorly understood. And given the complexities and the lack of resources available for this task, it goes on to state, and I quote, "Governments and researchers alone will not be effective in recovering this species. Success will depend on a high level of awareness and strong determination within the general public of Nova Scotia to maintain and enhance conditions for moose numbers to increase." And so the general public heard, and they became involved, and they contacted governments and expressed their concern, but government did not listen. Forestry practices did not change. The Leahy report was commissioned by the government, and it cited the problems with forestry in Nova Scotia, the rampant clear-cutting and environmental damage. But it has now been years since the Leahy report was published, and still no real changes have been made. And so the people also did what the report recommended. They gathered, lawfully, peacefully, and they protested. Some chose to go to the forest and attempt to shield the land with their own bodies, and by their presence make their concerns known. There were school teachers and mothers and fathers, scientists, academics, and working men and women, grandmothers and grandfathers and children. They gathered and faced discomforts and cold, all to do the right thing and advocate for an endangered species, which the provincial government has ignored despite its own commission reports, legislation, and even court decisions. But they did their job. The world heard. The media took interest. So much so that the pulp cartel felt it needed to respond, and it did so through the voice of Marcus Wicker, general manager of Westfor, who published his piece, Mainland Moose, Forestry Can Coexist, on the Chronicle Herald website on December 14th at 2 p.m. It was updated again on December 15th. While it appears in the opinions section, it is clearly an attempt at rhetoric and contains the usual tropes arguing that deforestation is okay, because it's done in a controlled manner, a little bit at a time, and trees grow back. This is footage of one of those controlled clear-cuts, what's sometimes referred to as an overstory removal, a violent process that leaves the land deeply rutted, scarred with jagged stone and broken boulders, the soil disrupted, and the old trees, so rare in the modern ecosystem, gone, with only a few left standing, almost like sentinels, reminders of what has been lost. But it goes on to say that these particular clear-cuts in the critical mainland moose habitat must be okay because they were following the special management practices identified by the Department of Lands Forestry. This is the very same Department of Lands Forestry that was rebuked by the court only earlier this year for its abject inability to show that it has done its job reliably or responsibly, or even competently to conserve endangered species. But Nova Scotia government has a long history of siding with big industry no matter what. And so it came as no surprise to anyone involved in the protests when the arrest came. Police entered the camp and arrested anyone who refused to stop their protest as they were ordered. And when protesters entered the DLF office in Halifax with a simple request to meet the minister and voice their concerns, they too were met with a cold shoulder and arrest. I had the privilege of interviewing many of the concerned persons, scientists and protesters who have been involved in the fight to save Nova Scotia's mainland moose as well as other endangered species. Here are some of their voices.
The Department of Lands and Forestry and harvesting companies insist that they employ what they refer to as sustainable management practices in this region. And I've taken some photographs of this so-called variable retention. It's heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking. The life has gone out of the forest.
It was shocking and devastating to see the damage done with the clear cutting in this area within only a few years. Massive areas removed with nothing left but rocks, ruts, and compacted soil and debris, leaving only a few dying, straggly trees after this assault. All I feel when I see the damage done is anger and grief for the creatures that called those areas home. They are left with nothing but a death sentence as their world dries up and dies. I made the choice to stand with the forest protectors and spent what time I had with them at the blockades in the effort to get this government to stop the destruction of the endangered moose habitat. Basically because the government chose to ignore all reasonable requests to talk to the people about the clear cutting in the endangered moose habitat.
I was startled by how ravaged it was. You know, I went in on the logging roads on a kind of exploration in the middle of October with a local man who had put up a Facebook post about how present the mainland moose were in the area. And that first time we went and looked at a 750-acre clear cut that was smack in the area between the Tobiatic Wilderness and the Silver River Wilderness. I mean, every direction you looked, it was clear cut with huge logging roads through it.
This video is about the endangered Nova Scotia mainland moose, but it is entitled Intentional Extirpation, and I have called it that for two reasons. The first reason relates to a story that is really quite extraordinary. About 10 years ago, a biologist who worked with DLF met with me on condition of anonymity, and with tears in his eyes, he told me a story that one might have thought of as unbelievable. He wept about the state of the forest and about how he had been disempowered to do anything about it, noting that things that used to be crimes and incur substantial fines were often glanced over. And then he told me that there was a plan between DLF and the forestry cartel to allow certain endangered species to die out. The idea being that once they were gone, people could no longer protest their absence, and regulations against rampant clear-cutting could thereby be further eased. I know, it sounds like something out of a bizarre conspiracy theory, but here we are, in an undeniable environmental crisis, where numerous endangered species within the province of Nova Scotia are on the brink, and DLF in concert with the government turns a blind eye, while allowing the forestry cartel to police itself and essentially do whatever it will back in the woods. And so I am brought to point 2 behind the title for this documentary. My academic background is psychology, a field I entered because I was interested in the presentation of consciousness within nature. And in the course of gaining my degrees, I heavily studied behavior science. And in the realm of behavior science, there is an adage that what someone says doesn't matter nearly as much as what they do. If you want to know who or what someone is, just look at their actions. And I find it impossible to look at the actions of the Department of Lands and Forestry and the disinterest of the Nova Scotia government, whatever political party is currently operating it, and find anything other than goal-driven behavior leading toward intentional extirpation. And at this point, given this degree of corruption, it is only the voice of brave citizens, the grandmothers and grandfathers and school teachers and scientists and parents who are willing to speak up, going so far as to put themselves at risk and accept arrest, who can possibly force a change and make a difference. Thank you for watching. The Naturalist program is committed to the reliable coverage of natural science and environmental issues. Please take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing and never will, but it sure helps a lot.